SABC News presentation.
And you're watching Interface here on SABC3. A warm welcome to you. As you know, it's been 20 years since many of us queued at polling stations around the country to elect South Africa's first democratic government. For many of us, it was our first time, and it was described as a miracle. Apartheid laws were abolished and replaced by a new constitution that is, to this day, hailed as one of the best in the world. Fast forward 20 years, how is this country faring now? Are we still making good progress? Or have we veered off our path? That's the question that we are asking tonight on Interface. And our guests are Jimmy Manyi, who is the president of the Progressive Professionals Forum, Herman Mashaba, who is the chairman of the Free Market Foundation, and Sisonke Msimang, who is the director of advocacy for the Sonke Gender Justice. And as always, if you do like to drop us your thoughts, do so on our Interface page. It is Interface on SABC3. That's how you find us on Facebook. Or you can tweet me at Tembisa Machele. Welcome, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
So let's get this one out of the way. Let me throw this question at you. Let me start with you, Herman. South Africa in 2014 is a much better place to live in than under apartheid. Agree, disagree?
Well, I think it depends really where one comes from. Obviously, I think, for some people, absolutely great, but for some of our countrymen, it's really not. And I believe as a country, we need to really really face these realities to really understand where we are. We've really made some great strides the last 20 years. I think, as you mentioned earlier on, 1994, that voting period really gave us that liberation. But at the end of the day, I think we really need to look at some of the economic issues because, unfortunately, we've got some of our people who are not really active participants in enjoying the fruits of this country from an economic point of view. And I think for me, from a Free Market Foundation, those are the issues that we're seeing as a country. How can we really deal with them so that we can get all of us as South Africans to really be the beneficiaries of this new democracy.
So issues aside, but Jimmy, should we even be contesting the statement that South Africa is a better place to live in 2014 than it was under apartheid? Should we even be discussing that?
I think it's actually a very mute question, really. I mean, even the DA agrees that South Africa is a far better place. Herman, if he's being honored to South Africa, he would know that he comes back from the days where he was being chased around by police when he was busy hustling. Today, he's got a very posh office in Sandton. So really, South Africa is a far better place for everyone, including Herman.
Sisonke?
I think it is. I think there's no question that in terms of dignity, the kind of dignity that is bestowed upon us by our Constitution, the kind of dignity that allows us to move from place to place without being questioned, South Africa is a far better place. I do think there are real questions to be raised about our economic position, the economic position of many of our countrymen and women, particularly women, but certainly it's a better place than it was.
All right, let's get to those issues. Let's start here. A better life for all. That's what your party promised us. That is the African National Congress. Come 1994, we all had these great hopes. Are we still on track for that, or have we veered off our path?
We've not veered. I think the first thing, Tim said to get straight, in fact, when you're opening, you said there was a miracle. There's no miracle. People have worked hard. People have died for this democracy that we have. No miracle.
I said it was described as a miracle.
That description is incorrect. It's not a miracle. People gave their life for this. You must remember what we inherited when we started off in 1994. We inherited a serious economic crisis. We inherited a serious debt in our current accounts. We inherited a highly skewed economy that was racially segregated. If you look today, I think the very important thing to look at is, because people can say things, the important thing to look at is what is the empirical evidence giving us. If you look at Goldman Sachs, which is a global investment bank, and they've got a whole range of things that they're saying, but very briefly, if you look at just 3-4 things. One, look at the investment grade. That when this government took over, we had a very low investment grade, some BB investment grade that we had. We're sitting here with BBB investment grade. So South Africa is a place where foreign direct investment can come in. We started off with a very weak, even if you look at the stock exchange, market cap of maybe around R1 trillion. Today, we're sitting with a market cap that's sitting at around R8 trillion. If you look at the number of people that are employed, when we started with only about 9 odd million people that were employed. Today, we're sitting with some 15 million people that are employed. This thing goes on. If you look at people with electricity, we started off with some level of about 54% or so electrification rate. Today, we're sitting with a huge, almost 85% people that have got electricity.
Okay.
So it's a real good story to tell.
Are you impressed by these stats?
Well, I think what Jimmy is elaborating, I think it obviously really makes sense. But at the same time, I think let's really look at our unemployment situation in our country. We're sitting with one of the highest unemployment rates in the world, almost. We're talking about 25%, but in actual fact, we're sitting with almost 36% unemployment rate in our country. But at the same time, I think I'm not really obviously disregarding the progress that this country has made. I mean, there's no question about that.
But the question I'm asking is, are we on the right track?
Now, I think from an economic point of view,
yes,
absolutely not. If you really look at an issue around unemployment, and unemployment as a result of us as a country failing to produce small businesses, I think we've really reached, created the situation in the last 20 years where we've created the situation as if business is an enemy of the people. And I think the biggest casualties on this has really been small business in this country, and small business, particular black one. So we're supposed to have really been the one to actually arrest this high unemployment
so
in our country.
The policies are in place. Where do you think the problem is?
I think if you really listen to rhetoric in our country to a large extent, you hear this thing where business is regarded as an enemy of the people. And also, what I actually call our draconian labor legislation. I think we come from a country where in the past we had those racist, evil system of racial discrimination against our people. But at the end of the day, then come to 1994, we then obviously trying to really redress the problem. Then we went on the other side, that is where something I've always referred to, that there can never really be, two wrongs can never really make a right. Because if you look at this draconian labor legislation in our country today, if we don't really do anything about it, can only really deprive our people an opportunity
I want
to
us to touch on the labor issue after the break, but Sisonke, your thoughts on this?
I think that there's no question that South Africa is making good progress in a number of areas. I think there's no contesting the kind of statistics that Mr. Manye has shared with us. I think we spent the first 20 years of our democracy, we hit the ground running, a government that had to deliver to the majority, really began to roll out quite seriously electrification, water connections, housing, RDP houses. So I think the first 20 years has been a real learning curve for our government. And I think we've done well on numbers. Not as well as we could have, but I think we've done pretty well on numbers, I think, if we're going to be fair. I think what we have to do is raise questions about the quality of the services and the quality of the education we're providing, health, etc. So there are real questions about quality. So if there's anywhere we're veering off track, if that's the question,
it's on quality.
It's around quality.
All right, hold that thought. We will pick up on it just after the short break. As always, if you do want to drop us your thoughts on our Facebook page, it's Interface on SABC3, or you can find me on Twitter. It's @Tembisa. Stay tuned. Welcome back. So your Facebook messages are coming in thick and fast. Do keep them coming. We'll try and get to them towards the end of the program. But let's pick up on the issue that Sisonke raised before the break, and that is the issue of quality. Is it time to sit back and say, okay, for the first 20 years, we tried the best that we could to put the fundamentals in place. Some things are not sitting right. If you look at BEE, if you look at some of the issues that have been raised, healthcare, if you look at education, now let's have a relook. Is it time for that?
Yeah, no, look, I think Sisonke here, there's an age issue. Clearly, she came later in the development of things when things were even better, so the differential will look very small to her. But if you look at some of us that have been at it for so long, we can actually see the big change. Firstly, if you look at the period between 1980 and 1994, the growth rate was sitting at about 1.2%. But if you look at the growth rate between 94 to date, we are sitting at some 3.2%. So that's huge. And I think what has disturbed this growth that was taking very well has been that economic crisis that disturbed us around 2010, that period. That's what has actually sunk us.
But is it time for a relook, is the question I'm asking.
This government, if you look, for instance, has been constantly on review, and review. And if you look, for instance, the BE as an example, when it started in 2003 as a economic policy for inclusion of black people, as it were. As we sit right now, there's been so many reviews on the codes of good practice just to make sure that it's fine-tuned to be able to take care of things.
But the general sentiment is that it's not working.
It is working very well. In fact, if you look at the numbers, you see people that say it's not working, they're not looking at the numbers. Look at the numbers. If you look at, for instance, the issue of the black middle class as an example, and you look at the report, and cut the rhetoric aside, okay. look at the facts. The Unilever report has recently reported that the black middle class has grown from nothing to where we're sitting now at about 4 million, as it were. Okay. If you look at the spending pace of these black diamonds, black middle class, it's now sitting at about 350 billion. Yeah? So that you can't wish that away.
All right.
So that means BE is working very well.
All right, we'll get you to respond just now, Herman, but I just want to ask, are you too young to understand what's going on here?
I think it's fantastic that there's an assumption that I'm younger than I actually am.
Lovely.
I won't disclose on national television the actual age. Yes. I will admit to being born in the 1970s, so I'm not quite sure that I'm too young to be able to tell. But I think the real issue is that even on this matter of reviews, and I think that it's absolutely correct, our government has been excellent at rolling out policies, at putting in place a very good legal framework. I work on women's rights issues, I work on gender equality issues, and we see that we have the best laws and policies in the world, and in fact, we don't have one of the best constitutions in the world, we have the best constitution in the world. I mean, I'm very proud of that. What we have not been great at, and again, part of this is a learning curve, and part of this is other issues, and we can get to those later. But what we haven't been so great at is figuring out how we make that transition from having a good policy and a good legal framework to being able to implement. And implementation is what touches people's lives, and that's where we get people beginning to be frustrated. Again, we had a lot to do. There's no question that in 20 years we've done a lot. But there are real questions about the quality of what we are rolling out, and that speaks to a deficit in implementation and the capacity of the state and our communities to be able to do all the things that we need to do in a way that makes people satisfied. And at some point, I'd like us to talk about what you think needs to be done better or differently. But let's talk about BEE, Herman.
In fact, I think, Jimmy, on the question of BEE, I think definitely I will really disagree with you that we believe BEE is succeeding. Absolutely not. Because I think, when we came out with legislation in the 2000 where we wanted BEE to really be able to really touch majority of our citizens and poor people in particular. Unfortunately, we're still really very far from actually achieving that. I think for us, really coming out with legislation after legislation, we're not really solving the challenge. I think when we came out with the codes in 2000, early 2000, I mean, great elements where we're not just really focusing on ownership alone. And I think it's really unfortunate that we keep on really harping so much on ownership as if it's the only element. I think if we need to really be successful, and BEE is necessary in this country, there's no doubt about that. But what can we do as a country to ensure that BEE touches ordinary South Africans in Venda, in Kwamashu? And I think this is really where I believe as a country we are failing and failing dismally. If you look at the black business guys, ordinary blacks in the townships and our communities, do they have access to this BEE? Absolutely not. The only way you can really have BEE opportunities would really be privileged South Africans like myself, where you have the money to really buy shares in existing businesses. But at the end of the day, that man in Venda or in whatever township or village, does he have access to BEE? Absolutely not.
But that's a misconception, Timson. Big misconception. I'm disappointed that Herman at this point has not understood this. BEE as we have it today has got 7 elements. The one that he is harping on is only the one element which is ownership, which he can afford. The people elsewhere that he's referring to are being addressed by the other elements of the BEE. BEE has got 7 elements. One of them is ownership. The other one is management control, which talks to the executive and so on, skills development, etc. But the important
those
thing,
people that he's talking about are being touched by the other elements
Yes.
of BEE, why do we have these service delivery protests that we are seeing?
yeah, but I'll get to that. This is why it's important when we have these discussions that we don't harp on the rhetoric. Let's look at the numbers. If you look, for instance, way back then, people that were poorest of the poor, that were not getting anything because of the approach of BEE and the approach of the change in the way government is spending. We had, when we started, something like 2 or 3 million people that were on social grants, on a whole range of support system. Today we're sitting with about 16 million of those people. If you look at the companies spent on the CSI, on the corporate social responsibility, way back then, companies were spending a pittance. Today, if you look for the past 10 years, companies' increase in their CSR has been in the order of 10% and so on. So there's been a huge expenditure to make sure that the poorest of the poor.
So the question is, why so many service delivery protests? Why are people revolting all over the country?
You must check the pattern of this revolt. The pattern of the pattern of this revolt actually happens in areas where there's adjacent delivery next door. In a very poor area where absolutely nothing is happening, there is no protest. The protest is because people see that delivery is happening in this geographic area next to me, and they can't wait for the delivery to get to them. That's the thing. It's an issue of patience, and it's actually a sign that delivery is happening, but the pace of delivery, which is controlled by the resources, is the issue.
Do you buy that,
I
Suzanne?
don't. I don't buy that. I think.
But it's a fact.
I think that it's important.
Let's
I think
give her a
it's
chance.
important to recognize once again, and this is, I think, if there's anything that's been, we haven't talked about this yet, but I think it's important to talk about the issue of leadership. So if there's anything that's where we are veering off track in terms of our current government, it's certainly an issue of leadership. And I think what you see in terms of the service delivery protests, in community after community where you have service delivery protests, what we know, and there's an excellent report that's been done on this called The Smoke That Calls by some researchers at WITS. What you see in community after community is that where there's the worst service delivery protests is where there's been a real breakdown in leadership at the local council level. Where people feel as though their local councillors are arrogant, where they don't respond to them, where they keep them waiting, where there are no answers for what are often relatively easy questions to answer. And if they're hard, then the ruling party and the municipal management need to sort out the problem. So service delivery is really about a crisis of confidence in leadership, not necessarily about the numbers, because we can talk about numbers until the cows come home. But the issue is how those numbers are interpreted and how they're felt on the ground.
I think it will really be, for me, I don't know how, what I'll actually tell the people of Karamotsi, where I was born and brought up in Amanskral. You know, in the mid-90s, you know, people had water into their yards. I grew up stealing water to survive. And obviously the new government came, our people actually had water in their yards. But what is interesting, the last 3-4 years, that village, every time I go, our taps are empty. And now, how do I say to our people that things are working out? It was wonderful, we had this, but the taps have been empty, been dry for the last 3-4 years.
All right.
You know, I could give you an example of a tar road actually going. I was really so excited when in our village a tar road was built. Within 5 years, I can take you there. You would not, in fact, even recognize that a tar road was ever built in that area.
So it's a service issue.
It's an issue that we're saying is that as a country, how can we really manage this issue so that we don't really see a repetition?
But it speaks to the issue of quality that I was raising again.
Let's take another short break, and the question that we're asking is, the service delivery protests that we are seeing all over the country, are they a sign that this government is failing, or are they just a sign of people being impatient for the services to get to them? Give us your thoughts on Interface at SABC 3 on Facebook. Stay with us. All right, right, we are in our final segment of this discussion, looking at the past 20 years of our democracy. Are you impressed with what's happened, or are you disgruntled because you have not received your services? Do give us your thoughts on our Facebook page, Interface on SABC3, or you can tweet me at Tembisa Magele. But Herman, former President Thabo Mbeki said that government and business in particular are speaking past each other, and that is at the crux of why we are not getting things right as a country.
I totally
Why
really
is that?
agree with this. And I think it's up to really government to really deal with this matter. When you have so-called communists in your midst, you've got a huge challenge, because communists by their nature, they believe business is the enemy. And I think our government really need to really address this matter, because unfortunately, I think I've always admitted that I'm a capitalist and I love the capitalist system. I don't just like it, I love the system, because it's the system that can really free and give us the total freedom as human beings.
But is that system not responsible for some of the ills that we've seen in this country?
Absolutely not. I take my personal example of what the system has obviously really created. Today, I have the capacity to really spend more than 50% of my time on social issues, using excess money that I've made out of the capitalist system.
Okay, are the communists the problem?
I think the labels are a problem. What's important that this government has created an enabling environment for people to thrive. I think that's what we should really underscore here. Herman is making a lot of money. He has been embraced. This didn't happen because people's hearts were good. It happened simply because the government put into place policies that ensured that this happens. And in fact, the problem that we have is that the private sector does not play ball, unfortunately so. If you look, for instance, at the big swindle we've just had with the construction sector, where 50 billion of taxpayers' money was swindled by the construction cartel. And when government was trying to make sure that there's job creation, and already this coming fiscus, government will be spending over $1 trillion on infrastructure. And we hope that as government does that, it doesn't get swindled again. So government is always trying to make sure that there's an enabling environment, but Mr. Mashaba and his friends are really not playing the part.
Well, I think, Jimmy, we as South Africans need to make sure that we live in a country where there's a rule of law, where people must understand there are consequences. And that's a society and a world that I'd really like to live in. So it's up to the government to really come out with a legislative framework and the rule of law, and people
but
understand that.
the rule of law is there. What Jimmy is raising, Herman, is the issue of corruption. And that is corruption that, I'm looking at our Facebook messages and our Twitter messages, that is coming through very strongly, that corruption is one of the biggest problems.
There's going to be
a
consequences.
lot of the times, that's pointed at government. But what he's saying is that the private sector itself is probably just as corrupt, if not more corrupt.
But the government has got the arm to implement the rule of law. So
what
the government needs to do is that in any case where you see an emergence of corruption or illegality, then it's up to the government to ensure that they apply the rule of law, irrespective of who you are.
The president, as we sit, this president, President Zuma, has signed the most proclamations to investigate all these corruptions, more than any other president ever in this country. So from a government point of view, corruption is not tolerated. The fact that it's not tolerated does not mean it does not exist. The challenge we have is in the private sector, where corruption is given different titles. People talk, it's a euphemism that happens in the private environment, where things like corruption get called maybe insider trading, market allocation, collusion. And all of these things, it's just corruption.
Okay.
And I think South Africans need to, when we talk about zero tolerance, the first place to start is the private sector.
Okay, Sisonke, let's bring you in right now. Corruption, Jimmy says this government is actually at the forefront of fighting this corruption.
Of course.
Look,
Would you agree?
I think that this speaks to the question I raised earlier about leadership. So I think there's no question that on paper, South Africa does very well. So in terms of proclamations, in terms of committees, in terms of all manner of structures that are set up to look into issues of corruption, we've got them. You can tick the box, absolutely. In terms of action and the extent to which those what we say about corruption actually translates into real life, I think we're falling short. And there is no question that the private sector has a lot to answer for. The Competition Commission finding against the private sector, the fine of 5 billion rands is a significant amount, but it's nothing. It pales in comparison to what was stolen. And that money that was stolen by the private sector, and I'll use that term because that's exactly what it amounts to, even though other words are, there's lots of euphemisms. But that money was taken from the state. That's tax money. I think that the outrage that we have seen amongst the public to the private sector is much more muted than the outrage we see from the public when it comes to the manner in which the state behaves. And I think there are real questions around that. That doesn't let the state off the hook. And the difference is, of course, that we vote in people who are sitting in the state.
Oh, I wish I could touch on some of...
I think it's not just a question of government talking about corruption. Government has got the arm to implement anyone who breaks the law. And I think people who actually in this country want to really see that happening.
I think the only issue here is procedures. You see, we live in a constitutional democracy. We can't be emotional. Government, when it does whatever it does, it has to do it within procedure. Kosato just learned a very, very painful lesson that if you don't follow procedure, things happen to you.
All right, we're going to have to wrap this up, but I just want a final thought from you on reconciliation, and we're just going to pick on you, Sisonke. Reconciliation, the fact that there's so many of us that are still so angry about so much that was done in apartheid times. How do we get that right?
I think we get that right by recognizing that the structures of power that we took over when we formed this new state remain very much in place, and the only way that those structures will be dealt with is if we have continuous commitment to having the conversation and to not being defensive when criticisms are raised. So I think we've got to keep on talking, but we've also got to keep on acting.
All right. I still don't have an answer to my question. Are we on the right track in unison? Yes, no?
We are very much on the right track.
Somewhat.
And the whole country has agreed that the biggest problem facing us is inequality, and we just need to resolve to deal with inequality.
We're going to have to
Always
leave
the
it
last
there.
word.
We're going to have to leave it there. This is a very fascinating discussion, and I'm sure that it will continue on our Facebook page and on our Twitter line. And as always, to give us those thoughts, keep them coming, even on our email. We have to end it there for tonight. Thank you very much for joining us. Good night.
I sometimes forget.